I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. A Chinese-born Canadian tycoon is expected to go on trial in China today, 5 years after he vanished from Hong Kong during an anti-corruption crackdown. A government statement says Canadian diplomats are monitoring the case of Xiao Jianhua closely. Mr. Xiao, the founder of Tomorrow Group, vanished from a Hong Kong hotel. This was during an upsurge of prosecutions of Chinese business people accused of bribery and other misconduct. Authorities have never confirmed whether Mr. Xiao was detained or disclosed any possible charges. His disappearance came as the ruling Communist Party was stepping up efforts to pressure people wanted in corruption cases to return from abroad to stand trial. This fueled fears that Beijing might be abducting people. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this case and its significance to Canada is Dr. Charles Burton, China expert and senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Dr. Burton, welcome back to Forum Daily. Now, Mr. Xiao was allegedly kidnapped by Chinese agents in January 2017. So what do we know so far about his prior disappearance?
Well, it was a shocking event at the time because Mr. Xiao had been living in a suite in the Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Hong Kong with a large group of all-female bodyguards. And then Chinese agents came to the hotel with a wheelchair and a large suitcase, and shortly thereafter left with Mr. Xiao in the wheelchair covered with a blanket. Our understanding is that he was then put in a boat and shipped back to China, although the Chinese government deny that. But then once he disappeared from the Four Seasons Hotel, we weren't able to have any information on where he was and what charges were laid. He just vanished.
Sounds like the events in a movie, Dr. Burton. Now, why was he targeted by the Chinese government in the first place?
Well, Mr. Xiao was involved in a lot of financial and insurance businesses, and he really, was seen as a kind of banker for the Chinese communist elite to enrich themselves. So he has close associations with the current leader, Xi Jinping's elder sister, Xi Qiaoqiao, who had, when Mr. Xi came to power, sold a lot of her assets to Mr. Xiao, presumably at a generous profit for her. Someone who, subsequently we found out through reports by Bloomberg and the New York Times had hundreds of millions of dollars in Hong Kong and elsewhere. And more significantly, he was involved with the clique of Mr. Xi's rival, Jiang Zemin, particularly the former fourth-ranked member of the Politburo, Jia Qingling, and a man who might have been the successor to Mr. Jiang, Zheng Jinghong. So, Mr. Xiao knows a lot about the dubious dealings in enormous sums of money of people who are associated with the most senior levels of the communist regime. And therefore, I think, they would like to have him give evidence against Mr. Xi's rivals and not to talk about his dealings with Mr. Xi's own family. And this is the fact that it's coming to a close now is probably related to the upcoming Chinese Communist Party Congress, which should be taking place in the fall.
And we know Mr. Xiao is a Canadian citizen. We mentioned Canadian diplomats are watching this case very closely. So what is the significance of this case to the Canadian government and Canada as a whole?
I think it's enormously concerning to us that the Chinese government have refused to allow the Canadian authorities consular access to Mr. Xiao as a Canadian citizen. Under international law, we should have been informed within 48 hours of his arrest, informed of the charges against him, and allowed access to him in prison to see that he's in good shape and to assist him in obtaining defense, and that Canada should be allowed to attend any judicial procedure against him. The Chinese government has denied all of this, and it really calls into question the status of the 300,000 Canadian citizens in Hong Kong. If they are of Chinese ethnic origin, will the Chinese government refuse to acknowledge that they are, in fact, our countrymen, our co-nationals, Canadians?
All right, Dr. Burton, we've got a quick 30 seconds left here, but what are you keeping your eyes on as this case unfolds?
Well, I'll certainly be interested to see if it gives us any further insight into corruption at the senior levels of the communist regime. But my guess is that we won't have any access to any of the genuine information that Mr. Xiao may have about that regime and the people associated with it at the highest levels.
Lots of unanswered questions. Dr. Burton, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
Good to speak with you.
The violence in Ukraine continues to make headlines around the world as concerns rise around how long Russia's invasion of the country could last. But one organization is pointing to the deeper impact of war on the future generations of countries plagued with conflict. According to Yasmin Sharif, Director of Education Cannot Wait, the UN's Global Fund for Education in Emergencies, Ukraine is one of many crisis countries facing targeted attacks on education. The organization points to the 222 million crisis-affected children worldwide that are in need of educational support. And this violence around schools has a lasting impact on not only the futures of children in such countries, but the futures of the countries themselves. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this is Ms. Yasmin Sharif herself. Ma'am, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with the war in Ukraine, ma'am. How has this violence impacted education and schools in the country in particular?
Well, it's had a terrifying, devastating impact. Over 700 schools have been targeted, and it appears that there have been intentional targeting of education facilities, which of course is prohibited under international law. We are speaking about a school-age population of 5.7 million children and adolescents who are affected by this conflict. We have 2.2 million among them who are in urgent need of education support. They can't go to school. The schools are being bombed. There's destruction, and the overall danger of that conflict forces them on into remote learning, either across the border or from home. But even that is not sufficient when infrastructure is being destroyed.
And unfortunately, Ukraine is one of the many crisis-affected countries where schools could be the target of violence. Why are schools the target of violence in the first place?
Well, first of all, schools are targeted around the globe. We see it in Nigeria, we see it in Cameroon, we see it in the Sahel, and during the conflict in Syria and so forth. And we see it even in Afghanistan, where girls' secondary education is being affected. Warring parties either intentionally targeted because it's a way of breaking down the social fabric, making sure that the next generation is not educated. They use it to store weapons or use it to launch attacks, which is also prohibited under international law. So often, I would say frequently, it's the children and the youth of a society that are the immediate target, suffering the brunt of an armed conflict.
And considering that children are our future, and I know you just touched on this a little bit, but how does all of this impact the future progress of these crisis-affected countries?
Well, I travel a lot, and I went to Moldova and I met with refugee children and youth arriving there with their mothers. I've traveled across the Sahel, Mali, Chad, South Sudan, in Afghanistan, around the globe. You see children and young people who are traumatized, distraught, and are falling behind in their learning. And as a result, they are exposed to other dangers in a much greater extent. Girls are married away at a very young age, unwanted pregnancies. They're forced into trafficking, which is part of the war economy. Boys are drawn in to militias, terrorist groups, or armies, becoming child soldiers rather than pursuing an education. And as a result, because today a new report by Education Cannot Wait shows that there are 222 million children and adolescents in conflicts, in forced displacement and climate-induced disasters who are no access to a quality education 222 million dreams risk being lost and turn into devastating consequences as those I have outlined. And that will have an impact, a consequence on all of us, whether we live in the Sahel or we live in Canada, the United States, or in Europe. We are all going to be affected by it.
Some really heartbreaking information there, ma'am. Just about 30 seconds left here, but what can our Canadian viewers do to help?
Well, Canada is a generous country of great solidarity. Education cannot wait. It's the United Nations Global Fund for Education in Conflict and Crisis. We have a high-level conference, pledging conference, financing conference, hosted by the government of Switzerland, together with Germany, Canada, Niger, and South Sudan in Geneva, Switzerland, in February 2023. Join our movement.
A pair of new reports from the Bank of Canada point to rising inflation expectations by Canadian businesses and consumers. The central bank's Business Outlook survey found businesses' expectations for near-term inflation have increased, and firms also expect inflation to be high for longer than they did in the previous survey. The bank's Canadian survey of consumer expectations indicates expectations for inflation have also risen, with worries about prices for food, gas, and rent. And the rising cost of food is having an impact on the way Canadians spend their money. A report released by Food Banks Canada last month indicated that 1 in 4 Canadians are eating less than they believe they should because of inflation. Well, joining us now to tell us more about these rising prices and what you can do to get the nutrition you need without breaking the bank is Dr. Sylvain Charlebois, Senior Director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Dr. Charlebois, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you.
So let's start with which food products are being impacted most by inflation?
Well, right now the dairy section is a problem. We're seeing prices increase by as much as 10 to 15%. Bakery actually has been a non-story for a few years. Prices are going up there. The meat counter is actually not too bad. Some prices have actually dropped in recent months, but they remain quite high. The center of the store as well, I would say, really, we're seeing prices for processed foods increasing quite significantly due to transportation costs.
And we know these rising prices are connected with the war in Ukraine, and there's also the impact of the pandemic, supply chain issues, and more. So how long can these rising prices continue in Canada, Doctor?
Well, so we're getting close to a peak situation. So prices are still increasing, but we're seeing signs that that things are slowing down a little bit. Supply chains are getting better. They're becoming more efficient, and commodity prices have started to drop, which is probably going to ease some pressure across the food system. So we are expecting perhaps to peak sometime either in July or August, which is actually good news. So we're going to start seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, if you will.
Well, that's good to hear, Dr. Charlebois. Now, I want to jump to the survey from Food Banks Canada. 1 in 4 Canadians are eating less than they believe they should. Is this a sustainable way to live during inflation, Dr. Charlebois?
It's tough, absolutely. So a lot of us are fortunate. We will have enough money to feed ourselves, to feed our loved ones, but many people are being left behind. At 10%, the food inflation rate is quite violent for a greater number of people. We are expecting the food insecurity rate to increase in Canada, unfortunately, for two reasons. One, there's the cost of food has gone up, but also there's less food diverted towards food banks because we're trying to rescue food as people, and of course companies are also trying to rescue food. So food waste is dropping, but at the same time there's less food given to food banks.
And staying on that note, Doctor, we know the lowest income households are going to be the most affected by these rising prices. So what steps can such households take to ensure they have enough food for their families?
Well, so first of all, eat what you buy as much as possible. There are apps out there you can use to rescue food as much as possible. They're available anywhere in Canada, and those apps would include apps like Food Hero, Flash Food, Too Good to Go. Those are really popular apps. Allows you to actually have access to food that are at a discount, and I'm talking 30, 40, sometimes 50% off on meat and dairy products. So those sales are pretty significant. So I would take advantage of that. And of course, if you go to the grocery store, make sure you know exactly how much you should pay for certain items on your list, because if you don't, then you're likely to spend way more money than you should.
All right, Doctor, just about 30 seconds left here, but are there any steps that our officials can take to support Canadians when it comes to food prices?
Well, obviously, taxes are a big issue right now. I think I would focus more on the revenues side of things. Cost prices are prices, but on the revenue side, I think it's time for us to have a conversation around a guaranteed income for citizens in Canada, and of course, taxes on processed foods are certainly something that we need to look into as soon as possible.
Dr. Charlebois, always great having you on Forum Daily. Thank you again for your time today.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Forum Daily Week in Review will be right back after a short break. Stay with us. The deaths of 53 migrants in an abandoned semi-truck in San Antonio, Texas last week is just one of many cases around the world where people who are looking for a better life for their families meet a bitter end. According to the Migration Data Portal, since 2014, over 4,000 fatalities have been recorded on migratory routes worldwide. However, these numbers represent a minimum estimate, as most migrant deaths go unrecorded. To add to this, the global refugee crisis has seen 100 million people around the world being forced to flee their homes. This according to the UNHCR. Well, amid all this displacement, what role can Canada take to help? And is it realistic to think we can support these crises? Well, joining us now to talk more on Canada's role amid rising migration and refugee rates around the world is the Honourable Bob Rae, Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Rae, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you so much. Good to be with you.
Good to see you again, sir. Now, I want to start off with a recent contribution you made in the Globe and Mail. In it, you spoke on the changing climate in the world and how the displacement of people may become the norm. So what sort of moral obligation does Canada have to help?
Well, I think the key word is help. We're not going to be able to solve the issue by ourselves. It's much bigger than us, but we have to be part of the solution. And I think that's where we have some real credibility in the past in helping to resolve conflicts, responding to climate change, and also showing that we're open to accepting people from around the world to become Canadian citizens, which is, I think, very much now part of Canada's whole approach to the global community, which I think is a very important example.
Now, we know the war in Ukraine is only adding to conflicts seen around the world and the displacement of people. So is it realistic for Canada to play, as you say, a helping hand in all of these conflicts?
Well, I don't really think it's not only realistic, Nima, I think it's also is essential. Stressing the two-way point, really, that there's a lot more that we can do and need to do to make sure that our approach is generous and fair. And secondly, to reinforce for Canadians the fact that not all the solution involves Canada simply taking people in. It also involves finding solutions to the crisis. So we're trying to find a solution to the crisis in Ukraine, which has been caused by Russian aggression. And we have to keep trying to do that.
And to add to that, you mentioned in your post in the Globe and Mail that we have some important choices to make in shaping the future amid a world, as you say, is contested up for grabs. So what sorts of choices will we need to make in the near future?
Well, I think there's two. One of them is, are we prepared to remain committed to an open approach to both refugees and immigration? I think we should, personally. That's my view. I think most Canadians feel that way. Our record has been really quite extraordinary over the last 50 years in accepting people from around the world. But the second issue is this global crisis, which is climate change, COVID, conflict, is one that requires continuing participation and engagement by Canada, which frankly means money. We have to be prepared to really assist in the global effort to deal with the extent of this crisis.
And bringing this back home, we know Canada is a country that prides itself in its multiculturalism and many immigrant citizens. But what sort of role can migrants and refugees play in helping build our country?
Well, historically, they played a very key role. We've made it a policy over the last several decades of accepting people. I can remember as a kid in school when the first Hungarian refugees came out of the invasion of Russia against Hungary in 1956. I think all of us can remember well the Vietnamese boat crisis in the 1980s, when a conservative government actually led the way in seeing that 50,000 Vietnamese boat people were accepted in Canada. At the time, that seemed like an extraordinary effort, but frankly, it's come to be a tradition. The Syrian refugee situation, the current Afghan situation, the situation involving the Ukrainian people, we've responded well. And I think we need to keep responding well because it makes a huge difference to allowing our country to continue to grow and to succeed. All the evidence is that refugees, migrants, immigrants all play a key role in strengthening the fabric of Canada.
Ambassador Ray, thank you again for another important conversation.
Thank you so much, Nima. Good to be with you. Thank you. Good to talk.
Hope to see you again, sir. Thank you. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you can visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks for joining us today on the Forum Daily Week in Review, and we'll see you again next time. Have a great week in Canada.